Sources tell CBS News Iran's retaliation was expected and calibrated. Now, we're learning U.S. officials held meetings this weekend and this morning to prepare for an attack on the U.S. airbase in Qatar. So let's bring in CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, what do we know about the U.S. and its preparation for this attack? Clearly, how is it perceiving this retaliation also?
Well, Jules, just a few moments ago, the president himself on Truth Social laid out some of the details in his reaction to tonight's attacks on the U.S. military base there in Qatar. Writing on Truth Social, Iran has officially responded to our obliteration of their nuclear facilities with what he calls a very weak response, which we expected and had very effectively countered. He says there have been 14 missiles fired by Iran. 13 were knocked down, and one was set free because it was headed in a non-threatening direction. He adds, I'm pleased to report that no Americans were harmed and hardly any damage was done. Most importantly, they've gotten it all out of their system. And there will hopefully be no further hate, he says. I want to thank Iran for giving us, this is important, early notice, which made it possible for no lives to be lost and nobody to be injured. Perhaps Iran can now proceed to peace and harmony in the region, and I will enthusiastically encourage Israel to do the same. He adds in a subsequent Truth Social, congratulations, world. It's time for peace. So what the president, at least right now, is signaling perhaps is, we did what we did over the weekend. Iran has now responded in kind. Let's leave it at that and try to move on or try to get back to the negotiating table. And he confirms a few details there. One, he says Iran gave someone a heads up that this was happening, so the United States was prepared. Two, the number of missiles, we had heard some of that, similar figures, about 14 of them, most missing the airbase. And then the fact that no Americans were killed. We did not have specific casualty figures yet. But we know now that, yes, over the weekend and into this morning, the president and his team were anticipating and preparing for this kind of retaliatory strike. You heard the Speaker of the House a little while ago say he got a classified briefing this morning where the possibility of this was raised. And the early indications came when Qatar closed its airspace earlier today. That was a signal that they were anticipating something happening that could have potentially been far worse. But at least for now, based on what the president is saying, 14 missiles, no American injuries, and in his view, in his hope, the world can move on.
Yeah, the latest information, Ed. Thank you. Also, President Trump says the Iranian nuclear sites hit by U.S. strikes were totally destroyed. Can we be certain that all of Iran's enriched uranium was at those sites when the strikes hit?
We cannot. And unless or until there is independent verification of that, which there may never be, it's going to be difficult to know for certain. And he's not happy about it. He's already blaming reporters or media outlets for suggesting that it might not have been there. He insists it was. Remember, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was asked over the weekend by Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan whether or not the U.S. was certain it was all there. His response was, we don't see how they could have possibly moved it in time and where they would have moved it to, because Iran is under such heavy surveillance by the Israelis and the Americans that any attempt to move something out of those facilities would have been seen and possibly dealt with sooner. But again, absent independent verification of some sort, it's impossible to know whether all of it was destroyed.
Yeah, and Ed, it's important to note you're in the Netherlands where President Trump and his NATO counterparts will gather for a summit. So what's on the table and what does the president hope to get out of it?
Well, we are still expecting him to leave early tomorrow morning Washington time and get here in time for dinner for meetings with leaders of the military alliance. The big item on the agenda is going to be an agreement amongst the member nations to increase their defense spending to about 5% of their GDP. That would be actual military equipment and personnel, plus the infrastructure that's needed to support that. So roads, bridges, ports, airports, and other infrastructure that might be built in the country to support its military. The goal has been one of the president's since his first term, when he started berating NATO member nations for not paying more into the alliance so that the United States could start reducing its commitments. Only since his election last year and amid the war in Ukraine have several other member nations conceded it's time to start getting to as close to 5% GDP as possible. We don't know all the details, but the hope is to have most of those countries paying that much soon, so that they boost their defense spending, and in at least the view of the president, they can back off American forces and equipment here. The NATO Secretary General basically telling member nations, you've got about 5 years to start spending that much money on your own defense because it could take Russia that long to prepare for a major war across Europe.
Ed O'Keefe. Ed, thank you so much.